everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you to this year's last ÖFG Peaceful Change lecture series. Some of you have gone through a lot of them, and there'll be more to come next year. But for 2023, it's the last one. And I'd like to introduce you to today's speaker. That's Christine Reh. She's professor of European politics at the Hertie School in Berlin. And I think she traveled for quite a bit, so I think we can do a round of applause. Christine, thanks a lot for coming here. Christine is, maybe I should start this on a personal note. She is a former colleague of mine. So long time ago, once upon a time, there were two young lecturers at the University College London, full of enthusiasm about political science. And so we started at the same year at the Department of Political Science, School of Public Policy at University College London. And Christine has always done very, very exciting things on the European Union, written on EU agenda setting, on citizenship, on elections, on the EU's political system as a whole. Just have the printout of citations in front of me. So there's a piece on institutional anatomy and 5 policy modes, super widely cited. Congratulations for that. And so she knows a lot about the European Union. Then also some time ago, we did a project together on compromise. Was a special issue then in government and opposition. Together with our former boss, Richard Bellamy, so it was the 3 of us. It was great fun doing that. And Christina, who knows, maybe in future we're going to do Compromise 2.0 or something like that. It was a really great project. And Christina is going to talk today about, it's a poetic title almost, In the Shadow of the Heads, assessing the influence of the European Council on supranational lawmaking. So she's basically going to take us somewhere into the border zones, I would say, between supranationality and intergovernmental arrangements. She's going to talk for about half an hour, perhaps a little longer, and then you have plenty of opportunity to ask questions. Christine.
Thank you very much, Markus. A very warm welcome from my side too, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here. And let me start off by saying, so Markus introduced me as working on the European Union, which I do, and I'm particularly interested in the European Union's institutions. I'm interested in decision-making, and I'm interested in legitimacy. And this paper, which is co-authored with Edoardo Bressanelli, who works in Pisa, and Christel Koop, who she stuck it out in London. She's still there. She's at King's College, so this is a paper we have co-authored. It is also a paper really on institutions, legitimacy, and decision-making, and it looks at the European Council, and it asks whether the European Council's legislative priorities, as expressed in summit conclusions, influence the duration of EU lawmaking. Now, you may want to ask now, what exactly is the European Council? How does EU lawmaking work? And why on earth should the European Council speed up EU lawmaking? So let me start you off with a few words on the European Council. So the European Council joins heads of state or government in regular meetings. Also, the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Council since 2009, and the High Representative of the European Union for Foreign Affairs and Security. Let me introduce you to the first European Council, 1975, in Dublin. You see only men, of course, probably perhaps some female translators, but that's a little bit different. In the European Council during lockdown, of course, they still had to meet, and like all of us, they met on Zoom or other online platforms. Here you see the current European Council President, Charles Michel. Now, a picture of today. This is the place where the European Council meets. And of course, now there are also some women in the European Council. So for Austria, Nehammer is in the European Council. For France, Emmanuel Macron. For the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. And as I already said, the head of the European Council, President of the European Council, Charles Michel. And this is the logo of the European Council and the Council of the European Union. Now, I said that the European Council expresses priorities on EU laws in its summit conclusions. So after formal European summits, what happens is that the heads of state or government, what they do is they agree on the key social, economic, political challenges of the European Union. And after the summit conclusions are produced, and they are basically the summary of the summits. Now, what I would like to show you here, right, on the summit conclusions are the mandates that the European Council gives to the other institutions. So if you see the first part, the European Commission and the Union legislators are invited to increase the EU's attractiveness for production, investment, and innovation, right? And to improve the regulatory environment for investments, right? So this is a call on the Commission and the legislators to work in that area. In point E, calls for speeding up adoption, transposition, and implementation of Union legislation in the single market area, classic EU policy, single market, economic integration, and regulation. And the final one calls on the European Commission to present a comprehensive energy union, note 2014, we all know what happened in 2014, well ahead of the March 2015 European Council. Now, we're interested in whether the European Council shortens the duration of EU lawmaking, right? And I don't know if all of you or some of you know the EU's legislative procedure called co-decision, ordinary legislative procedure. Just one sentence on it. The Commission tables proposals. The Council of Ministers, not the European Council, Council of Ministers and the European Parliament co-decide the laws. So what is the European Council doing there? So we argue that the European Council, heads of state or government, exercises collective leadership. As heads of government, right, European Council members run national governments, hold political authority, and since they are elected, right, or appointed by Parliament, they also bring legitimacy. We argue that authority of the heads of state or government translates into a hierarchical relationship with the other EU institutions and the member states. And I just showed you these mandates in the summit conclusions. These, we argue, are key to speed up decision-making. We argue that authority is particularly strong under three conditions. First, post-2009. In 2009, I'll talk about that in a moment, the European Council got formally institutionalized and now has this permanent leadership through the president. In crisis, where the EU lacks rules and also capacity, but where the EU faces political urgency of action, and under politicization, when the EU, its policies, and we argue the national heads, become a lot more visible at the national and at the supranational level. So what do we contribute? There are lots of debates about the duration of EU lawmaking. It's a little bit an obsession of EU scholars, but what the literature looks at so far are like types of legislation, what kind of legislative procedure is used, what are the majorities required, what is the ideological difference, for example, between the Council and the Parliament. And all that, the literature argues, shortens or lengthens lawmaking. If then you look at the literature on the European Council, this is much more systemic. Right? So scholars look at the long-term development, look at crisis leadership, look at the role the European Council plays in the EU's political system. So don't look really at lawmaking that particular group of literature doesn't really look at lawmaking. There is a group of scholars who do look at lawmaking, but they do case studies of individual pieces of legislation. Give you one example. My co-author Eduardo Brefanelli has written a paper on how the European Council intervened in the 2-pack and the 6-pack on economic and financial governance during the euro crisis. So what's missing? We think two things. First, an argument that links the European Council and debates about the European Council, right, in EU politics with comparative politics on the one hand and with international relations on the other hand, and really a systematic analysis of the European Council's impact on everyday EU lawmaking, including duration or speed. Okay? And that gets us to our research question, which is about the conditions under which the European Council accelerates lawmaking, and the empirical focus is all laws that have been co-decided between 1999 and 2023. So we have quite a big data set. So if you look at the European Council and EU lawmaking, then in fact the European Council shouldn't intervene at all. In fact, the European Council is forbidden in the treaty, banned in the treaty, shall not exercise legislative functions. That's Article 15.1 of the Treaty on the European Union, for those of you who are more interested perhaps in the constitutional law side of European politics. What the treaty does empower the European Council to do is to provide the Union with the necessary impetus, right, with general political directions and priorities. So it's pretty clear from the treaties the European Council should sort of lead, but definitely not lead on legislation. But I've already just shown you some of the mandates, right, that happen routinely, repeatedly in the European Council conclusions. So what the European Council does is it mandates EU institutions and member states. It specifies legislative objectives and priorities in these conclusions. And the mandate does two things. It instructs, right? So work more, work faster is the instruction side. Sounds almost like studying, right? And the discretion side is the right and the space to work, right? So on legislation that the European Council, the heads, want to be done. Now, we have a big data set, and we are also very interested in how these summit conclusions actually come about. So throughout this year, we conducted a lot of interviews with people who work in relation to the European Council, in the EU institutions, in national ministries, in permanent representations, and asked them how are these summit conclusions, which we use to code, right, the European Council's priorities, how are they actually prepared? So I give you a very snapshot of how they come about. It starts about 6 weeks before the summit, where the president of the European Council, the cabinet, his currently cabinet, and the General Secretariat, that's sort of the bureaucracy that assists the Council and the European Council, they produce an annotated draft agenda for the heads when they meet, so that it's clear what they talk about. Now, the draft agenda and the guidelines, and later on, the draft agenda and the conclusions are discussed and consulted with the European Commission, with the EEAS, so that's sort of the diplomatic service of the EU, with the presidency country that runs the EU for 6 months always. It's a rotating presidency. And the General Affairs Council and COREPER, where the ambassadors meet. So these institutions and actors are also involved in coming up with the conclusions. 2 days before the summit, the agenda and the conclusions go to the national capitals, sent to capitals by the president of the European Council. And just before the summits, what the president of the European Council does is he meets with small groups of leaders and exposes them to each other and exposes them to each other's arguments and counter-arguments on issues that are still outstanding for the summit. We were also interested in how these council conclusions, European Council conclusions, are followed up. So they are followed up in all institutions by the General Secretariat, by the European Commission, in COREPER, and in national capitals. The European Parliament, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the European Parliament in a minute, isn't particularly thrilled by the European Council's intervention, but gets briefed after the summits by the President. So we were wondering then, okay, so this is how the conclusions are prepared, this is how they are followed up. Are they really an instrument of political leadership for the heads of state or government? And if you would like, I don't know, Markus, if you share the slides perhaps with the students, these are hyperlinks if you are interested in how this process happens. There are also rules of procedure of the European Council and writings by practitioners about how this process works. Okay, so far I introduced you to the European Council, I introduced you to the summit conclusions, I briefly summarized what EU lawmaking is, and I gave you our general argument and what I think is our contribution to the literature. So let me show you now some more detailed examples of what is sort of going on in these conclusions. So what you see here is on all the years, right, where European Councils happen. On the left side, you see the number of the EU summits. On the right side, legislation mentioned. What you see is in 2003, most legislation in the summit conclusions. And then well, difficult to see from here, in 2013 and 2016, also quite a few pieces of legislation prioritized in the summit conclusions, just for you to get a sense. And then this, I mentioned that EU institutions get mandated, and this is an example of who actually gets mandated in these summit conclusions. So the lightest block is the European Commission, so gets mandated most. But second most mandated are the co-legislators together, so the European Parliament and the Council. Least mandated alone is the European Parliament. So just for you to get a sense who gets talked to in these summit conclusions. Okay, so why do we think that the European Council should accelerate lawmaking? So we argue first that legislation that is prioritized by the European Council shortens the lawmaking process, or is shorter than non-prioritized legislation. And we make an argument that's based on the political authority of heads of state or government. We argue that the authority translates into a hierarchical relationship in the multi-level context that is EU lawmaking, right? The EU makes laws, but they can't work if they're not implemented in the member states, so you have a multi-level context of decision-making. We argue that the Council, so that's ministers at the highest level, ambassadors, sort of at the medium level, and officials at the working group levels, we argue that they follow the heads' instructions, the ministers, because it's the heads. And if you look at the last decades, what you see in European politics is a presidentialization of political systems, right? So the ministers should follow their heads. And the ambassadors and officials, right, they act as representatives of their national governments. And we assume that they want to comply and are complying with the instructions that come up from the national level, from the ministries that they represent. With the European Commission, some of you may know how the European Commission is nominated and appointed. The European Council plays a key role in this process. You may remember the Spitzenkandidaten process in the last election, where the Spitzenkandidaten didn't get the job, but Ursula von der Leyen, there was a big debate between the European Council and the parliaments, and they had to stitch up a compromise consisting of Ursula von der Leyen for Germany and Christine Lagarde, who runs the European Central Bank. But what we argue is that the European Council, through its appointment of the European Commission, has a certain degree of control over it. We also argue that the Commission seeks guidance from the heads of state or government to push certain or boost certain individual pieces of legislation, and that legislative resources, rooms, translation, etc., are tight and need to be prioritized. And we argue this is also what is happening if the heads of state or government clearly signal this is a law we want passed and we want passed quickly, these resources get prioritized. Now, the European Parliament is trickier in terms of arguments. What we argue, well, obviously the European Council is not accountable to the European Parliament, right, at all, accountable to national parliaments, not to the European one. We argue that the relationship works through political parties. So if you look at co-decision, what you see is that there are obviously coalitions in the Council, there are coalitions in the European Parliament, and those coalitions overlap increasingly, on the one hand. And on the other hand, national and European parties run so-called pre-summits, so before the heads of state or government meet. For example, the European People's Party, the Conservatives at the European level, they meet, pre-discuss the summit. Because if you think about heads of state or government, what else are they? Often, most often, they are also heads of national political parties and then meet with Europarliamentarians, for example, before the summit. And the third point we are making is that domestic politicization of the EU, right, and its policies gives the heads visibility, more visibility, at the national level and at the supranational level. So that's our first argument, right? If the European Council prioritizes, legislation goes faster. There's some literature you might like to have a look at if this is something that interests you. So we argue this effect will be particularly strong under two conditions: A, post-Lisbon, and B, under crisis. So let's start with post-Lisbon. So we propose that post-Lisbon, so from 2010 onwards, the impact of the European Council's prioritization on the duration of lawmaking is particularly strong. Why do we think this? We think this for two reasons. So the first one is that as an official EU institution, the European Council now has formal leadership in the person of the president and also has institutional administrative backing in Brussels through the General Secretariat, which backs the European Council, but also backs the Council. Right? So it has a very excellent overview of what is going on. It has the institutional memory in the European Union. It's full of very skilled, often lawyers, bureaucrats, who support the European Council in Brussels. And we think that matters for the European Council to be able to guide and direct the other institutions. And also, if you think about the European Union post-2009, you probably think Euro crisis, refugee crisis, COVID crisis, Ukraine, energy, lots of challenges that have come up post-2009. So we propose, and the literature backs us in that politicization has intensified since the 2009 Lisbon Treaty, and that the visibility of heads is high, their visibility as problem solvers, and that ministers and Europarliamentarians benefit from that visibility. Okay, so first argument, prioritization matters. Second argument, it matters, particularly post-2009. And the third argument is it matters in particular when laws are crisis-related. Why is that? We argue that a crisis is a sudden shock, a sudden exogenous shock on the EU's political system that uncovers the previous failures of integrating. And by failure, I'm not a federalist, right? Failure, I don't mean the EU needs to be a fully fledged state. It just, for example, if you think about economic governance, wasn't as not nearly as developed as monetary governance when the euro crisis, and the sovereign debt crisis hit the EU. Decision making is also different in crisis, right? It's open, it's fast, it's exceptional, and it's observed a lot by the public and by citizens. At the same time, so Luc van Middelaar, who used to be the speechwriter of the first European Council, President Herman van Rompuy, argues from observing various crises that the EU just doesn't have the capacity and the rules to act in crisis. And under urgency and uncertainty, he argues that, but other scholars argue that as well, only the European Council has the capacity to act. And we argue in crisis, again, great visibility of the heads, and again, we propose that in crisis too, ministers and members of the European Parliament benefit at home, so to speak, from the visible attempts of their heads of state or government to address the crisis. So we ask whether the European Council, through its mandates, impacts on the duration or the speed of EU lawmaking. We argue yes, in general, and particularly post-2009 and in crisis situations. So what have we done? We have collected quite a bit of data. So our data set has 1,753 pieces of legislation in it, and it's based on two sources. All concluded legislation is in there. Legislation concluded under co-decision, and it's legislation from January 1999 till August 2023. That's one part. The other part are the European Council's priorities, which we got from the summit conclusions, and we hand-coded these from 1998 to December 2022. We think that co-decision should be a least likely case, right, considering that the European Council shouldn't intervene in this process. And for those of you who are interested in lawmaking, from the legal side perhaps, or from the procedural side, we only include substantive legislation. So for example, if a law is codified or recast, then we excluded those files. So our variables, I'll run you through these. Our outcome variable is duration, so that's the number of days that passes between the Commission tabling a law and the co-legislators agreeing. Our explanatory variables are European Council priority. It's a dichotomous variable, and that captures whether the summit conclusion explicitly mentions a law. So for example, energy union in the 2014 summit conclusions, we would code that as 1 and see what happens later on. Then we've got a period, so pre-post 2010, right? So that's a dummy also, coded 1 for laws concluded before, and since the 1st of January 2010, and 0 for the pre-Lisbon period. And then we've got crisis. There we went through every single European Commission explanatory memorandum and checked whether crisis is mentioned in all these different policy areas the EU is doing, and that we also interact with European Council priority. And then we have some control variables to see, right, whether our explanatory variables drive the process or whether it's variables that have been mentioned in the literature so far. For example, complexity is often mentioned, the type of legislation. We worked on Commission priorities in previous papers, so we included those as well. EU expansion, so does the law give the EU new powers, and domestic media salience. So we went through media in various countries. If anyone is interested in how we did that, we also did that for previous papers. I can explain. So what we used is a Cox proportional hazard regression. In plain English, we basically look at the laws. We look at only concluded legislation, and if a law comes out between 0 and 1, and I'll show you the table later, it means that it takes longer, and if it comes out above 1, it's shorter. So what did we find? Our main variable has no effect. So whether or not the European Council prioritizes a piece of legislation, doesn't make it shorter, doesn't make it longer, doesn't play a role. We have a strong, significant negative effect of the interaction of period and priority. So, and also of period separately, I'll show you in a moment. And what we also didn't find, we were a bit surprised, was that European Council priority and crisis do not interact either. However, if we look at crisis separately, strong and negative effect. So negative effect means it was indeed quicker. So let me show you our table. So we calculated various models. So what you see here are model 1 that has all variables in it and controls, but not the interactions. Model 2 has interactions with the period included, the 2010 onwards, and Model 3 has the crisis interaction in it. And what you see here is that crisis alone, you also see here that crisis alone matters, but priority and period matters most. And here you see again that crisis matters a lot, but that priority and crisis combined doesn't have an effect. What you see here are the effects of prioritization. I'm not sure whether that's really very well visible for you. So this is looking at our data and splitting it up into pre and post Lisbon and looking at whether European Council priorities matter, when they matter, and show these effects. What else do we find? We find that it takes longer to conclude legislation that is a priority of the European Commission. That surprised us, but it just takes longer. So in our previous paper, where we really looked at the priorities of the European Commission from the work programs, we had that data, and we make the argument that one reason for why it takes longer is that the Commission wants to boost legislation, and to boost legislation, it puts it into its work programs and makes it very visible, right, that the Commission itself wants to conclude a particular piece of legislation. So perhaps it's the difficult laws that are stuck that the Commission prioritizes. And then we have a couple of points that do what we expected them to do. Directives, so legislation that needs to be implemented at the national level takes longer, complex laws take longer, and if the powers of the EU are expanded, those laws also take longer. And if we look at the mandates, what we see is that the European Council mandates to the co-legislators, that's the European Parliament and the Council together, quite a lot of mandating is to the two of them, and these mandates are particularly effective. Okay, so overall implications and conclusions, what do we think we have found in this paper? So, in spite of the treaty's ban of the European Council involving itself in lawmaking, the European Council does that a lot. So, it's involved quite a bit in EU lawmaking. It's a recurrent feature. What we also see is that legislative prioritization is effective only, and very much so, but only post-Lisbon, so from 2010 onwards. And we also see a strong effect for crisis legislation in and of itself, but we don't see an effect of the speed-up effect being even more sped up by priorities of the heads of state or government. Now, as I said before, for us, the European Parliament is a bit troubling. Why does the European Parliament go ahead with this? If you read the documents on these debates, the European Parliament complains. Martin Schulz, the former president, really complains a lot about how the European Parliament can only, tick off some of the legislation prioritized by the European Council. So the European Parliament isn't very happy with this process, yet it often goes ahead. And our argument is that this is due to the cooperation across political parties before summits. And finally, so those of you who look at EU lawmaking or study EU decision-making are maybe used to look at this process through the institutional triangle, right? Commission, Council, Parliament. We think that one needs to include the European Council as a very active institution and really look at what its mandates do, how they come about, and what their effects are. Thank you very much for listening. Should I sit?
Yes.
Okay.
Christine, thanks a lot. I think there was a lot in the talk. Probably very, very topical, right? So there's a lot of talk about perma-crisis, poly-crisis and everything. And crisis is actually the thing that did make a difference in your findings. I think methodologically also for the students amongst you, really important, right? So if you don't find evidence for a hypothesis, that's also a very important finding. Yeah.
Yes,
because I know that students are very reluctant with the.
Yeah, and that's our fault, I think, as instructors also.
Oftentimes.
I think very often we argue, oh no, we can't support our hypothesis. That's good, right?
Yes.
That's what we're supposed to do as scientists.
Yeah, definitely.
But mostly people say, yes, I supported my hypothesis. That's great, but yeah.
Definitely, yeah. So if there's no evidence, that's definitely also an important finding. But let me hand over the word to you and ask questions. We have, as usually, a volunteer who's going to run around with a mic. Charlotte, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Charlotte.
And so whoever wants to ask a question, yes.
Hi, thank you. Oh, sorry. Thank you so much for being here today and also for making your research really digestible. I think that accessibility in academia is really important. But my question is, obviously the council's presidency changes every 6 months. And so I'm wondering what your thought process was on choosing broader variables rather than maybe more specific variables like the party of the presidency or things of that nature when conducting your research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll bundle questions, always 3 at a time. Yes, let's make it easy for Charlotte.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. Yeah, sort of a similar question, maybe something to think about in future research, but what's the impact when a government, a national government, is split in its executive, and so you have someone at the Council of Ministers from a different party versus who's sitting on the European Council, and wondering if that would change the results. So maybe something to think about in future research, and something I'd be curious to know about as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And then there was a question in front, Charlotte. In front as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Fernando. Good evening. Thank you very much for the lecture. You mentioned there is a treaty ban on the involvement of the European Council in the lawmaking of the EU. Nevertheless, it is a current feature. Is there a movement from other institutions in the European Union to restrain this practice? Thank you.
Thank you. So that's our first bundle, Christina.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the question on the presidency. So the Council of Ministers has a rotating presidency every 6 months. The European Council doesn't have that anymore. So that's why the European Council president, we think, makes a big difference, because that person chairs the meetings, calls the meetings, follows up on the meetings, and provides formal leadership. Perhaps I answer your second aspect about the parties in relation to your colleague's question essentially your question is about coalition governments, right? So why should, let's say, currently a minister of the Liberals in Germany go ahead with what Olaf Scholz from the SPD mandates together with the other heads. So that is really something, I think, which is interesting. We have looked a little bit in the literature on coalition governments, and we would argue that with the presidentialization of prime ministers, even if they are accountable, to obviously accountable to Parliament, but also like appointed by Parliament. We make the argument that even in coalition governments, the head has the key voice in the European Council, and we argue that ministers, right, no matter what coalition party they are in, would follow their heads because of the authority of the head. It's also at the domestic level, right? They compete very much. I mean, look at German politics at present, right? But we argue that what they see is the European Council agreeing on a compromise at the supranational level, and we think that the ministers, no matter whether they are in the Chancellery or right, or in the Élysée, right, will follow the heads if they bring down the compromise from the supranational level. It may not be correct. We don't know. But what many of our interviewees said, they stressed this party cooperation point. So if you, for example, have the leader of the opposition, right, they would also be in the European Council. If you look at the European Council, it's very much a coalition, quote-unquote, government. Right? You have socialists in there, conservatives. Now you have right-wing leaders several right-wing leaders in there. You have liberals in there. So the European Council is a coalition government. And if that European Council comes up with a compromise on what to prioritize, we argue that that travels down. But I think you're absolutely right, and we need to look more into that and also look more into the coalition government literature at the domestic level to make that point, like to give that point more meat. The point about whether the other institutions, you mean whether they try to restrain the European Council? So verbally, yes. If you read the quotations from Martin Schulz, they are really very strong, like, you shouldn't mandate the Commission, you shouldn't tell us what to do, we are the European Parliament. And then, of course, the whole, we are the only directly elected, etc., European institution. True, but, I mean, I think heads of state or of government are also elected, right, nationally, not at the supranational level. So they do try, but we only see this in the European Parliament. I think the Commission is very interesting. I think our arguments about the Commission in the paper as it currently stands are the best arguments in terms of why the Commission follows, or should, in our opinion, follow the heads. But the Commission really, the way our interviewees describe that, they argued very much the Commission presidents, also in the European Council, can't vote, but is there. Right? And they described how the Commission president really tries to speak to the leaders, convince the leaders to then go down, right, to the national level and mandate on the legislation that the Commission really cares about. So I find this relationship between the European Council and the Commission, I find really interesting. And there are also scholars who say that the European Council, yes, does exercise executive leadership, but so does the Commission, for example, in the COVID crisis. But that's a super interesting question. Thank you.
Christine, thank you. Next round of questions. Let's just do 1, 2, 3, and then we'll do another one. Yes, please. Go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your presentation. What would we have to do, for example, to cut the time it takes the legislation to get to the legislation, for example, in half? What
would help shortening it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is probably a very important question.
For the EU also, right?
Hi, I'm Navina. I'm a MICE2 student, and my question goes on kind of a tiny tangent. So I wrote one of my last papers in law school about, I'm going to say the title in German because it's easier, Intergouvernementalismus als Hindernis der unionalen Wertesicherung, where I looked at the European Council and the Council, and my findings were that it is a problem, but it's kind of inescapable from the way that both of those are set up. And I wanted to know if you think that that's also the case for lawmaking in the European Council, and do you also agree that this is an inescapable problem that we have to learn to work with and find mechanisms to deal with? Thank you.
Thank you. There was a second in our bundle and one more.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. My name is Katarina, and my question would be, what is the impact of Brexit on the dynamics of the European Council's engagement in supranational lawmaking, particularly in terms of reshaping relationships with departing member states and influencing the future direction of the EU legal frameworks?
Thank you.
Thank you, Christine.
Great. So what helps shortening legislation? So what we looked at before, I don't know, do you know what trilogues are? So the co-decision procedure, which we write about here, can play out in up to 3 stages. But what happens de facto, and again, the Parliament complains greatly about this, but totally goes along with it, is laws get passed at the first reading already. So what the Parliament does is it negotiates with the European Council, with the Council of Ministers, in informal settings called trilogues. Trilogues because Parliament, Council, Commission are in there. So what then happens de facto is that the Parliament includes the amendments to legislation that the Council of Ministers wants in its own amendments, so that the Council can just tick, right, and the law is agreed. There are no time limits in the first reading, so this process can really go on for a long, long time. But what we see de facto is that in time periods where you had different stages of lawmaking, the ones that use the trilogues and are agreed at first reading are really shorter. What we also find, and that is probably not surprising, is if like the negotiator and the council is of the same political party as the chief negotiator from the Parliament, that helps. Same nationality helps. So anything that sort of gives a deeper bond, so to speak, to the negotiators, we argued and saw in our paper, one of our previous papers, that shortens legislation. But yeah. The European Council and the Council on Intergovernmentalism. So personally, but that's my personal opinion, I think that the way the powers are allocated at the European level is good, right? So you've got the Commission, more political than before, but as the key institution looking after the interest of the European Union, looking after the interests of all states. Right? You've got the Parliament directly elected, you've got the Council representing the national governments, and you've got the European Council as the heads of state or government. It's true, I think, that the European Council has been, shown it, very, very active in lawmaking, but I do think that, for example, the appointment of the Commission, I personally think there's great legitimacy in the European Council and the Council as representing the member states and member state interests. Someone needs to do that. Personally, I think you can't just have a directly elected parliament. I think it's not, quote-unquote, fair, because bigger states have more parliamentarians, and also I think national governments need to be able to voice their concerns and their points. So I think, yes, maybe it's a bit problematic in terms of in individual laws, but I think the overall institutional structure works. I don't know if any of you are really interested in EU reform, so the European Parliament, what is it today? Today is Monday. Last week, then agreed on a proposal by Guy Verhofstadt, former leader of the Liberals in the European Parliament, and 3 other parliamentarians on reforming the EU and what to do about this, and calling on the European Council to start a convention to reform the treaties. If you are interested in EU reform and what has been proposed by the European Parliament, have a look at what happened last week. So the European Council and Brexit. So we are still debating in our crew whether Brexit is a crisis as we define it or not, right? So it's not exogenous, or one would need to, I think, stretch the argument very much to make it an exogenous case. it's more endogenous, and I think what Brexit has done for the moment is to unite the other member states a bit more. I think that was visible in the COVID crisis, for example. That's also visible in how the European Parliament and the Council handled Brexit legislation. So what you had is, okay, so there is one procedure under co-decision, which is called urgency, or urgent procedure, and that was used a lot, both for COVID and for Brexit. So I think the challenge, and I think that would be a real challenge, is apparently, that's what some of our interviews describe, that quite a few actors in the Council and the European Council like the urgency procedure, because it cuts out certain steps in the European Parliament, and they need to feel they need to come back, so to speak, to the normal way of co-legislating. So I think that probably that wasn't just Brexit, I think it was also COVID. I think it's also sort of the online meetings, right, which are often shorter than quote-unquote normal meetings. But they, for a time period in the now almost outgoing parliament, really accelerated lawmaking through this urgency procedure. So I think it will be very interesting to observe also now with continued, obviously, Ukraine, right, energy, now the war in the Middle East, so how that will continue.
Thank you. And then we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's do these 4 questions. I'm going to add one as well at the end. And yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Maurits. I was wondering what you think of the analysis of Luc van Middelaar, that the European Union was really founded as a politics of rules and now is moving to a politics of events, whereby the European Commission then applies more to the politics of rules and the European Council more to the politics events. And my second question would be what this means for the juridical legitimacy, because decisions have to be more spontaneous, have to be, maybe as a result leading to inequality, opt-outs between different member states. If you can comment on that, thank you.
Thank you. Then I think there was quite something in the,
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jan. I'm from Berlin. My question was actually getting back to the new reforms that were kind of talked about in the European Parliament recently. What is your take on the idea that kind of power to decide on the new head of a commission moves from the Council to the Parliament, and maybe on other key points of those ideas for reform? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
And then two in the front.
Thank you very much, Thomas Petanel, nice too. I was wondering, in your post-Lisbon data set, right? If we think about the last, let's say, 15 years, then I was thinking about where in this data set do you actually have samples of a non-crisis situation, right? Because after the financial crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, we had the Arab Spring, followed by Crimea, followed by migration, then Brexit, and then COVID. So how do you do this 0-1 sort of?
Yeah,
so,
sure.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Annie. I'm from Germany. Second year student here. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned that the European Parliament has felt a little bit alienated and dissatisfied. So I wanted to ask you whether you think that this could potentially undermine the cohesion and functioning of the organization as a whole, and how this could be reconciled. And
the
then
organization, the Parliament, or the European
the
Union?
European Union as a whole.
Okay.
And then you also mentioned the role of public perception and political parties. So I wanted to ask how your research positions itself regarding the democratic deficit debate surrounding the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to add one more question about the crisis, because I find that interesting. If I had sat now in the audience and I would have been a policymaker, then I would have said, hey, now I know how to speed things up. I'm going to portray it as a crisis.
Yeah.
So do you have any evidence there that such a strategy of crisisation is happening? And also, do you find that there has been contestation about whether something is a crisis or not, or has that been quite consensual for the most part?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for all these questions. Super helpful for our work. Luc van Middelaar, yeah. So I already mentioned for the rest of you what Luc van Middelaar's role was. He worked for Herman van Rompuy, and he wrote a book. In English, it's called Alarms, and he looks at how the European Union has developed and how it acts in crisis. And his argument is that sort of the intergovernmental versus supranational divide is over. What you have on the one hand is sort of the regulation, the day-to-day policy making, and you've got the quote-unquote events crisis where the European Council plays, is the one actor playing the key role. I think he is right for the crisis he looks at, a little bit like in my response to the Brexit question. I wonder whether it stays like this, right? So I do wonder whether the heads of state or government stay as involved, right? Whether they, considering that also many member states have political challenges, whether they can, quote unquote, almost afford to continue that involvement at the supranational level. But I think for the time period he looks at, I think he's absolutely right. Yeah, and I think it's a very interesting book. Someone asked me whether it would be good. It was you, I think. Whether the European Commission President should be nominated by the European Parliament instead of the European Council. So personally, as I already said to your colleague in the first row, I think the appointment of the Commission President by the European Council and then the voting in and sort of the grilling in the European Parliament, the questioning in the European Parliament is good because I think it shows the dual legitimacy of the European Union, right? So you've got the Parliament representing the citizens and you've got heads of state or government and ministers in council representing the states and the governments, right? I think this is the balance you need in an organization like the European Union. So I personally, I'm a bit more critical. I've worked a lot on the European Parliament and I, of course, like the European Parliament, and I hope, by the way, next year, right, you all go to vote if you have European citizenship. But I think it's very important to keep those two pillars. I'm also very critical of the this argument about reducing in the areas where you still have unanimity. I think there's a reason for why you have unanimity in some areas, like taxation, for example, or defense or foreign policy. I think there's a reason, and I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not a federalist. I don't think, right, it would help the European Union to move to majority in those areas. Non-crisis, yeah, we have lots and lots of non-crisis files. So the way we code crisis is, I don't know, has any one of you seen like a proposal of a piece of legislation by the European Commission? Have you ever looked at one? So perhaps one step back, the European Commission can only propose laws in areas where the European Union has powers. And what the Commission does for each piece of legislation is the Commission writes a so-called explanatory memorandum. And there the Commission explains why they come up with this piece of legislation at this particular point in time. So we read all of these memoranda and looked for the mention of crisis, of urgency, and of, well, I'll talk about contestation in a moment. So we have a lot of policy areas and a lot of legislation, so we really look at every single piece of legislation, which are non-crisis laws. In the previous version of the paper, we were a bit lazy, I thought. Like we took years and policy areas and just said all legislation falling into economic and financial governance from, I think we said, 2010 to 2012 are crisis legislation. But when you then actually look at the explanatory memoranda, it's just not correct, right? A lot of them are not related to crisis, but to other aspects of legislation. Yeah, I guess the European Parliament isn't very happy with the heads of state or government, quote-unquote, interfering. Again, a little bit as my question to my fellow Berliner, I would argue that it doesn't hurt the organization as a whole, right? So I think if you have conflict at the supranational level, right, Parliament versus European Council, I think that's good. Like some conflict in EU policy making and lawmaking is quite healthy, right? I think the European Union has been perhaps a bit too consensual over its existence. And I think in terms of democracy, I am a believer in the intergovernmental representation and the supranational European Parliament. I think that works. I think the European Commission, to my understanding, has become a bit too political. Probably can't be blamed given the current politics, but I do also quite like the idea of the technocratic commission. Of course, it gets a lot of banging, I mean, in the UK, right? I mean, the European Commission is Brussels, right? It's unelected bureaucrats terrible telling us what to do. It's not how it works, but it's how it's portrayed. So, yeah, but I do think this idea of technocratic commission, council represents member states, parliament represents Europe's citizens, I think in principle is the best the EU can be constructed democratically. Yeah, so there's really interesting work on contestation and crisis, and obviously increasingly so. So I don't know if you know Jonathan White's work. It's called Emergency Politics in the European Union. It's a recent book he wrote, and he's very critical of how the European Union has dealt with crisis. So his argument is exactly what you just said, right? So what happens? There's a crisis, and like the securitization, right, you just refer to with your crisisization, heads of state or government or actors, political actors more generally, portray a crisis as a crisis for various reasons, because they want to act, possibly because they want to reduce democratic control at the national level. They don't want the member states to come in, right? They want to call the shots, and they do. And there is also now recent work on trying to really go into a bit more detail on crisis, where the recognition of crisis, the contestation of crisis, and the crisis outcomes are analyzed by scholars. I can pass that on to you if you're interested, because that's really you're still a constructivist, right? So you're interested in in how but it's really oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Was that nothing wrong because I completely agree, right? What member states make of the crisis means they give themselves space to act, and they give themselves space to act faster and more liberally than in normal decision making. So I think that's super relevant.
Because crisis, there's something about sense-making and decision-making and meaning-making. So sense-making, I try to think together, is that a crisis? Yes, no. Meaning-making is more the strategic one. I burst out
what kind of crisis is it also?
And all of that has a lot of repercussions for the decision-making.
Absolutely.
Christine, thank you so much. It was a great talk. And please join me in another round of applause.
Thank you for all the questions. Super useful. No, really.
And if you want to continue to ask questions or just have a chat with her, we're going to meet just next door over a glass of wine. Okay? Thanks a lot for being here.